Okay, hello everyone. Welcome back. And today we're going to be starting our exploration into the exciting world of qualitative data analysis. I know you started this a little bit last week in your tutorials, so actually this is a continuation of the very beginning of this exploration. And I'm going to be building on some of the things that you talked about in tutorial and getting a little bit more deeper into this concept of coding in qualitative research, which is really central to how we approach qualitative data analysis. Um, and we're going to be talking today about codes and themes and how we pull that out of our data. So once you have collected this data, what do you do with it? How do you use it to inform your research question? How do you use it as a source of knowledge? How do you build from it to make some theorizing and come to some answers to your research questions using the data? So what is a code? A code is a way of assigning meaning to a piece of verbal data, written or verbal data. It can also be data that comes from observation. It can be data that comes from visual sources. So it doesn't have to be verbal necessarily, but is a way of assigning meaning to a piece of qualitative data. Often this is something that has been taken from the verbal and turned into the written. And so often we are using words and assigning codes to words, but this can be other forms of data as well. So a code itself is a word or short phrase that symbolically assigns this meaning in a summative way that captures the essence of this piece of data. And this can, again, be language-based or visual data. So it attributes meaning to the data through pattern detection and allows for categorization so that you can put different pieces of data together and then form themes and theories out of them. And I'm going to show you what that looks like. So it's used to summarize, distill, and condense data. But we don't want to reduce the data while we're doing this. And this did come up in our class last week when we were having our Zoom discussion about not wanting to fragment our data if we're taking holistic and sort of pluralistic approaches to our data. So we're going to explore what that looks like both this session and next session in terms of how we want coding to be able to help us make meaning, because we have a lot of data and we need to sort through it in a certain way, and we need to be systematic about it because that's the point of research. But we want to do that in a way that doesn't necessarily reduce it. And so how do we do that? And how do we honor our goals of our research questions while we're doing it? So again, a code sort of symbolically or summatively attributes meaning to a portion of data. And you have a video from this week that explicates that a little bit further for those who like to learn through that kind of medium. So how do you get codes? Where do they come from? Well, codes can come from two different ways. They can come from inductive approaches where you look at the data. Again, it can be text, it can be image, it can be notes that you make from observations of things in a participant observation model, and then you pull out what you see from that data. So in inductive, you're allowing the data to tell you what's happening. You're always looking at the data, but in an inductive approach, you're not coming in with any anticipated understanding of what you're going to see. You're letting the data lead. A deductive approach, you've already got some ideas of what you're looking for. That could be because you have a semi-structured interview guide, for example, the interview guide that you used for your assignment interviews. And so you have some ideas of the questions you've asked and the things that came up in the interview. And so you've already got kind of a framework. And last week when you did your brainstorming to come up with a coding framework during the tutorials, that's what you were doing. You were kind of pulling out some ideas of what might be in the data. This can also come from theories. So if you're coming in with a certain theoretical perspective on the data, then you might be coming in looking for the answers to those theories or looking for those theories being represented in the data. And sometimes, again, they come from your interview protocol. So a deductive approach, you're coming in to the data with already a set of ideas of what you're looking for in the data. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you have a code book completely set up. Your codes, you will identify them, but you will probably also be surprised by new things that you find in the data. And so, what are codes? This term has evolved over time. We have lots of different ways of approaching how to do coding in qualitative research. But essentially, they come down to, again, these ideas of these are different words that can be used for code. They're expressions in the data, they're incidents of data, perhaps, they're segments or thematic units. They're bits or chunks. Miles and Huberman were the first ones to start calling them codes, which is that you're reading into the data. When you think of what a code might mean to you, it means it gives you a sense of something. It gives you an impression of something. So you're reading into the data and you're naming it in a certain way to make sense of it. So they can also be understood as units or concepts or even labels, because you're giving a label to that piece of data. And so why do we code? Well, we code because we want to take the text and pull out pieces of the text that we're going to assign meaning to, that we're going to interpret. So we're very much in this act of interpretation and qualitative research. And then we're going to categorize those codes. So we're going to put similar codes together, or similar pieces of data together that we code under the same piece of code. So we might say, this is an example of climate change in my interview. And that might come up multiple times in your interview. And each parts of those examples or those codes, those pieces of text, are going to be put together, and then you're going to be able to say something broader about what is happening in relation to activism around climate change. And that means that you can look into one interview and pull out multiple pieces of data with the same code. And then you can look across multiple interviews and pull out multiple pieces of data with the same code. And so then you're putting together these pieces of data and you're categorizing them. And so you're putting together everything that's been said about this issue or this idea, whatever you're coding for, and then you're putting those into categories. And then from there, you can see broader theories emerging. And Saldana, in the reading from this week, describes this in depth, and this is an important reading for your next assignment and for understanding the process of qualitative analysis. And so, you're going from this large amount of data, you're pulling out specific parts of the text and coding them for specific things, and that allows you to, again, build categories that you can then build themes that become theories. And so, when you want to say something, at a higher level, and maybe even at a more holistic level about this data, then you need to go into the data and get sort of really immersed in what is being said in order to then step back from it and make a theory about it. So what happens is when you code your data, you then begin to cluster the data, and then categories and themes will emerge from that data. And so you can think of codes as critical links. They're the ways of moving from collecting your data, again, all the way into making meaning out of your data. So they're also, and this is a nice metaphor, they are the bones of your analysis. So, they form the skeleton by which you're going to hang the other materials of your analysis to make this theory that becomes a thing. Hopefully a breathing thing, if not a living thing, but something that actually provides meaning into the world. And so they're the bones of that theory making. And if you integrate the bones, you build this thing, which is a working skeleton of the theory. And so codes usually take the form of a word or a short phrase, and they're very summative in nature. And then when you build from codes to themes, you then have a theme takes the form of a phrase or a sentence. So they're more descriptive in nature, and they're more describing of a process. So a code summarizes a piece of data, a quote, say, from a participant, or an image that you see, or an experience of observation, and then multiple codes are put together to make a theme that becomes a description of the process that you're looking at, the thing that you're investigating. And Ryan and Bernard, another reading for this week, go into depth about how to move from codes to themes. And so this is, we don't want to just generate a whole bunch of codes. We want to use those codes to then put the things into categories and then create themes. So you're discovering a whole bunch of themes using your codes. Sometimes there's themes and sub-themes, and that's why we call about a code framework or a code book or even a code tree, and I'll show you some examples in a minute. So you have things laid out in a bit of a hierarchy. Your skeleton starts to become a bit of a hierarchy. And then you winnow those down to a few that you use to build your theories. So these are the building blocks of a specific theory. And again, I'm going to show you an example in a second. And then you link those theories together to make models. And so let's go back to the process of actually doing this before we get into some examples. So you're really looking for patterns when you're coding. And Saldana talks about different ways that we can see these patterns. So you might be looking for similarities across the data. That's very common. You might say, okay, that person said something very similar to another person. That's a very important thing. That's something that's emerging that multiple people are experiencing. That must be important to my research question. But you also might be looking at differences. How did person X and person Y see something? They might have seen it quite differently. This might come from their own positionality, as we've been talking about, and that might be very important, that their experiences led them to have a different experience from someone else, and that's very important information to you to answer your questions. Again, frequencies can be important. If you see this happening multiple times and you see it happening over and over again in your data, then that might be very important. You might also see X leading to Y. You might actually see a process forming in your data. Activists who engage in a certain kind of activism end up having some burnout. That might be a process that you observe and that you see that in multiple times, and then that might form a backbone of a theory that you're developing. And then they might also relate to each other. So how to do certain codes cause other codes? Do certain codes correspond to other codes? That's when you're, again, starting to build a tree or a framework of your theory. And so let's take an example in terms of looking for patterns. So you've probably played some of these kind of word games. You can look at a set of things and then what links them together. So in this first set of words here, lot, break, and garbage, what links those together? You may have already come up with the answer of parking lots, parking breaks, parking garage, not garbage. That wouldn't have made sense. Parking garage. And the second piece there, maybe you're jumping ahead of me, movie, home, musical. Well, that is a theater. Some of you might be into musical theater. You might have jumped into that one right away. That's what links those three words. And the final one, hunting, holiday, rainy, is denoting, or the linking word there together is season. So this is an example, of course, of how you can see patterns emerging from setting up a group of things together and seeing that there's a pattern or there's a relationship between them. But of course, in coding, it's very subjective, and we all see different things, and that's actually good. And often when we're coding, we can have multiple people code the same transcript, and then we can all see how different things are coming out of that, and we can learn together about different theories that might be emerging. But of course, coding, as we've discussed in qualitative research, sees knowledge as subjective and from various different positions, and so we all may see different things. And if we were all asked to draw this sketch of that image, we would probably all come up with a slightly different sketch. Some folks might come up with a very different sketch, and that's a way of thinking about how when we're looking through our lenses, we're interpreting what we're reading, what we're seeing, how we're engaging in our research, of course, all from different perspectives. So coding is a very subjective process, and it definitely yields different results depending on the coder. But we can do this process in a way that is very systematic, even though it is subjective. And in fact, coding is a way of building systematic approaches into qualitative research. But it is, of course, as I just said, relative to the lens of the person who's doing it, or the people who's doing it, because sometimes, as I've mentioned, we do code in groups in order to attenuate or acknowledge the subjectivity. But we also, it's also a very relational experience, as much of qualitative research it very much is. So coding is a judgment call, and there's no single set of right codes or themes or categories that are sort of waiting to be discovered. There are many ways to seeing the data. So how do you go about doing it, given all of this? And again, Ryan and Bernard give you some nice techniques or some nice ideas about that. And I think this is an important reading to engage with and also to reference when you're talking about your own experience of coding that you will be doing for your assignment. So you can look for transitions in the data, you can look for repetitions, again, you can look for similarities and differences, and Ryan and Bernard and Saldana have similar approaches to coding. You can look at, again, sort of the ways that the data influences each other. Pieces of data influence each other. If Z, then Y. So there may be correspondences between the data. And you can also look for something that they call indigenous typologies. Now, this is the word indigenous, meaning local, or local terms that, in particular, indigenous typologies are local terms that may sound unfamiliar or are used in unfamiliar ways. So indigenous meaning they're coming from a group that is using them and maybe using them very commonly, but they're specific to that group and may not make a lot of sense to people outside the group. I was trying to think of an example for this, and as I've mentioned, I work with youth, and this term "bae" was coming up a lot several years ago when I was working with young people. The word BAE, which you may know, which I did not know when I heard people saying it, and then I had to find out that it referred to a romantic partner, and actually refers refers to before anyone else, or that's what it's BAE stands for, and I didn't know that because I was outside of that group that was using that linguistic typology, and so you may see things like that in the data that may become very interesting. One, because you don't really know what they mean, and two, because they have special meaning to that group of people for a particular reason, and that can be something to look at in the data. You may also look for metaphors. Again, similar kind of approach that you're seeing people use storytelling or metaphor to talk about a specific thing, and that becomes very important because they're denoting that thing in a certain way. And you also may look for silences and what's missing in the data. What are people not talking about? It's very important to pay attention to that as well. That can often tell you, depending on your research question, more than what people are actually saying. So, there's lots of different ways that you can approach strategies in terms of coding and identifying what you're seeing in your data. But most important is really to go into the data and start to really work through it and start to label it and make sense of it. And so you have another video from the Mod U from this week. In fact, you have several videos that I hope do help to provide perspectives that help to unpack some of these ideas. So through the videos and the readings, there's a lot of explication about what this thing of coding is. If you do an open Google search or on YouTube, you will also find lots of explanations about coding and qualitative research. So there's lots of resources out there to help you delve into these things, but I really do encourage you to watch the videos for this week and also to do the readings especially because they really will give you a lot of examples. But one way to really ground the answer to how do I do this coding thing, if there's so many options about how I might code, is to really ground yourself in your research question. How is this answering my question? How is this answering the things that I'm most interested about in that research question? And that, of course, is how you bring the lens of your research to the things that are coming out in your data. So always come back to your question. And of course, the lens piece is incredibly important, that there is going to be your positionality. So the place that you come from is going to influence how you read that data, the kinds of questions you asked, the kinds of things you focused on in your interview guide. You had lots of things to focus on, but there were some things that you chose to focus on. Why did you do that? And why did the participant in the data, or your data subject, why did they focus on certain things? So those are filters that you're applying, that have been applied, so you can look through those lenses to try to make sense of your data. And also, you may have a certain angle. You may be someone who's experienced the question under investigation. You may be someone who has not. You may be someone who has worked for many years within that work and so has a sense of what is important. And there are many different angles through which you could look at making meaning out of your data, and that's okay, that's just fine, as long as you're very systematic about why you're doing that, as long as the best qualitative research describes where the researchers are coming from, why they took the perspectives that they did, and what was important to them in the data, and how they used that to make the meaning that they made. And there's lots of types of consideration that you need to take when you think about how to do these approaches. There might be a lot of work involved in coding, and that's the labor. There sometimes is some expertise that's required. And sometimes you have a lot of different themes coming out, and so you might need a team to help you with coding. I mentioned that we often do this in groups, especially if we have very large data sets, and people will engage in cross-coding. So they'll code something, and then someone else will code it, and then they'll sit together and say, okay, how did you see this data? This is what I saw. And this can be ways of managing the data. As I just mentioned, what's important is to make really clear and explicit decisions, and to come to some kind of agreement around the data. So when you're working in groups, you might come together when you're doing group coding, and you might say, I saw this, and another person might have saw something different, but usually there's some connection between the two things that you've seen, and you'll use that to build a new idea out of the data that builds on both of those ideas. It is also often done, and this is something that I do in my work, where you go back to the research participants and you tell them what you see in the data, and then they build on that. And that's how you're doing a more participatory version of making meaning out of the data. And that can be very helpful and often necessary depending on the kinds of questions you're asking or the kinds of context that you're working in. So one thing that we do want to pay attention to is the validity, the reliability, and importantly, the validity of qualitative data. So as I've just talked about, there's lots of different ways of seeing these things, but we want to make sure that we're doing that in a way that has validity. And one way that we do that is through a process we call triangulation. And so I just described one example of how we do triangulation, that we have multiple people look at the data, and then we make agreements together about what we see is most important coming out of the data. Or we go back to participants and we triangulate with the participant, which means we come from a certain perspective, but then we go back to another perspective, and we build that data together. We triangulate the data. So we look from multiple perspectives. And we also use multiple methods, and that is one of the most common ways of triangulation in qualitative research. So we might use interviews and focus groups. We might use interviews and participant observation, so that we can back up what we're saying because we see it in through multiple data collection points. So we might see it because multiple people are seeing it. We might see it because we're using multiple forms of methods to see it. And that helps us to prove, or to maybe not sort of firm proof, but helps us to justify and to feel that this is important, what we're seeing, and that we can back up the claims that we're making. And so coding obviously requires some very specific skills, like much research does. It requires a lot of organization. It definitely requires perseverance. Coding is a process that takes time, and usually it's an iterative process that we go over again multiple times. It's multiple cycles that we engage in when we're coding. It also requires the ability to deal with ambiguity. I think this was a nice discussion that came up in our Zoom session last week, where we have to live with the reality that there is no one right answer, or there sort of is no one perfect truth when we're thinking about qualitative research and the kinds of questions that we're asking. And so ambiguity is a part of this kind of research, and we want to be able to deal with it and even embrace it. Flexibility and creativity are very important, and can really lend themselves to building really interesting and powerful theory. And ethics is very important. So, having a rigorous ethical stance to how we approach coding, reflecting all of the kinds of issues around voice and power that we've been discussing all semester, is important for a good coder to have. And of course, an extensive vocabulary also helps. If you're assigning meaning using words, then the more nuanced words you have to assign that meaning, perhaps the more useful your coding frameworks will be. And there have been, and I think I've touched on them already in this discussion, some critiques against coding. Some folks find that coding can be somewhat reductionist. and that it is perhaps trying to be objective within a paradigm that embraces subjectivity and that has critiqued, as we've discussed in class already, notions of objectivity. So are we now kind of trying to apply objectivity when we were talking about critiques to objectivity? I feel that these critiques are important, but I also feel that coding is a very useful skill to have in qualitative research, and we can feel that there are tensions in it, just like I was talking about living with ambiguity. But we also need to use it, because otherwise we have a hard time making sense of our data and also justifying, as I just said about triangulation, justifying the sense that we're making out of the data. But it is somewhat instrumentalist, and it can be depending on how you use it. So it does require kind of breaking the data down, and I was really interesting to hear that people want to take a more holistic approach in qualitative research, and so there is some tension around this idea of trying to break things down. So we're going to talk about next week how we can use coding to make sense of our data, but then also move from themes to theories in a way that goes back to a more holistic approach. So yes, we are breaking the data down. Yes, we are kind of engaging in what might seem like counting of the data if we're talking about frequencies, or we're looking across multiple transcripts and trying to identify things that are happening multiple times. And weren't we saying we're qualitative, not quantitative? Are we now talking about counting? Maybe that's a bit of a tension. But we will see that we are doing this in order to then build a bigger whole out of the sum of the parts, and that's the theory piece. But yep, just like with everything else in qualitative research, there are tensions and there are questions that are in some ways unresolvable. And there's also, and this goes to the ethical stance piece that I was just speaking about, there also are contexts in which coding can be dangerous. And this can very much be dangerous if you're talking about making meaning out of something in a dynamic that relates to power imbalances, and you're not checking back with participants. You don't have participants on your research team. You're making meaning outside from a very outsider perspective. And if you think about the example of Indigenous populations and Indigenous cultures and traditional Indigenous knowledge, that can be very, very dangerous in particular. So, this is where we need to be extra careful with issues of voice and with a power sharing approach. And we need to really reflect on who and in what conditions should do this work and why. And if we're making meaning from a purely outsider perspective, especially in the case of the kinds of disruptive power imbalances that exist around traditional Indigenous knowledge, then that can create dangerous and has created dangerous meanings coming out of things. So we have to be careful to work within a real ethical stance. And I think we had a really nice discussion about the ways to approach this and the imperative around thinking about these things last week. And this is ongoing as we think about qualitative data analysis. And so I said we were going to get some examples, and we'll do that right now, and we'll also do that a little bit more in our next Zoom session. We'll be talking about how you'll be applying data analysis for your final assignment. And you'll also get to examples in your tutorials. So coming to tutorials and engaging actively in tutorials for the next several weeks will be crucial for you to learn these skills and to be able to apply them for the final assignment for this course. But you do have a nice example of a qualitative research piece that was done. It's, again, one of your readings for this week around food insecurity among Inuit women. And so this is an example of qualitative research that does a number of different things, and also shows you some example of themes that came out of data. So the research team, first of all, identifies itself very clearly and talks briefly but clearly about their positionality, addresses it directly. So they say in the article, the research team was comprised of one male and one female scientist, one male and one female local Inuit research assistant. So again, within the context of Indigenous experience, they have Indigenous folks on their research team, or Inuit, I should say, folks on the team. And they also identify where the other scientists are coming from in terms of their positionality, or at least one aspect of their positionality. They also talk about how they used multiple data methods. So they did use multiple data methods in order to triangulate their data in this example and in this work, in this research. So they used focus groups and interviews. And they also were conducted by the female researcher because they were working with female participants. So they made the point of mentioning that in their data methods. So they use focus groups and interviews to triangulate, and then from that they say an interview and focus group guide identifying key themes was used. So they used a guide to identify the key themes and to pull those out. So they talk about the themes in their data, and this seems like to me like they very much used a deductive approach in that they already had idea before they started coding their data about these themes of personal info, food systems, store foods, country foods, and health. So they were applying that coding framework onto the data, and then they pulled out specific topics from the data. Now, I would say that the methods section in this paper is not great because it doesn't really describe clearly how the codes came into the themes, but it does seem by reading between the lines that this was a deductive approach. But this is an example of how qualitative research themes are then used to build theories. So you then have this broader theory around determinants of food insecurity among Inuit women that they're building based on the themes that they've seen and the topics and the codes that are coming out of their themes. So the determinants arise from the thematic analysis of the interview content. And they then build this model, which they show here in a graphical format, to describe what's happening at a broader level. And this is where you're taking the topics, you're taking the codes, you're relating them to specific themes, and then you're building back out into a broader view, perhaps a more holistic view, to tell the story, the theory around what's creating food insecurity for these people. And so, broader social processes like poverty and weakening of food sharing, environmental conditions, costs of hunting, broader social processes are linked to themes, but they're pulled out to tell the bigger theoretical story of what's happening. And they're also linking this from local determinants to external stressors. So they're taking a very kind of local and then an even broader approach to talk about climate change as being a driver or a determinant of food insecurity in these contexts. So you can see that quite a meta theory is being built out of the process of identifying these themes, very deeply looking into the individual answers to the questions, and then building those back out into a broader theme. And I thought I would share an example from my work, which hopefully helps to illustrate this as well. This is a project that I'm involved with. It's called Making with Place. I've already talked a little bit about it. It's an arts-based research project where I'm working with young people to explore the idea of place. And I'm working with an agency called Sketch Working Arts that uses arts with youth who come from perspectives of oppression and have very important lived experiences that we want to engage into broader theory building. And so we see, again, our participants as co-researchers, as youth researchers, and we use a very inductive approach in our work. So we do not have a preset definition. So we are very interested in the idea of place, but we have never defined place for the participants. We have never talked about existing definitions of place. We have been very open-ended about wanting to go from their perspectives of whatever that means to them. And we've also been very open-ended by using an arts-based approach. So rather than having them describe what place means, folks have actually been using artistic mediums to express what place means to them. Sometimes that can be visual, sometimes that can be in the form of performance, sometimes that can be in the form of a documentary video kind of work. It's lots of different kinds of work that create the arts-based approaches that go into this work. But it is very open-ended in the fact that we're not defining this, and we're also allowing people to express what place means to them in multiple formats in creative ways. And so you see from this the codes that have been coming from our work. So these codes came out, you see in this image here, in this code tree, some of the meaning that we're making on the experiences that we've been having. So these codes have been applied to visual work that people have done. They've been applied to public art pieces that people have done. So we've been reading into those pieces to see what we see in them. And they've also been applied to discussions, like focus group discussions that we've had. So we've had some group discussions, and we've transcribed those discussions, and we've coded the data from those discussions. We've coded the focus group and interview data from those discussions. And then we've come up with these code trees. So the codes here that we've identified are in black and orange, and then we cluster those to create categories, which you see are the white categories. So you see that we have categories around land, around history, bodies in space, and also around pandemic and the historical context. And within those, for example, within the pandemic context, pandemic now and historically, we have two separate categories there. We have COVID, and then we have the racism and violence actions that have been happening in the time, in our recent times, the uprising and the anti-racist and anti-Black and Indigenous racism discourses and activisms that we've been seeing. And so you can see the codes that we have coded under these, that we've seen examples in our data relating to social distancing concerns, relating to confinement and isolation. We've also seen examples in our data related to Black, Indigenous Lives Matter movements. We've seen examples discussing police brutality. We've seen codes around gender-based violence. So these are all different codes that we've applied to the data to then assemble under the themes. Under the themes of pandemic, under the themes of land, we have codes around nature, plants, and flora. And these broader codes are built into themes and then built into categories, and then built out into themes. So in fact, the themes are the broad themes, or the sort of overarching themes are the yellow pieces in this code tree. And then under those are more categories, and then under those are more codes that help us build those categories. And you don't need to get too lost in the nomenclature of these things. The big important thing is that you're taking pieces of data, you're assigning a code or a meaning to these pieces of data, and then from there, you're clustering to make the broader categorizations and then the broader themes that come out of those categorizations. And as I mentioned, this is an iterative approach. And so you go back to the data. Once you have an initial code tree, you go back to the data, and then it gets more complex as you're building more deeply, reading more deeply into the data. And this was actually done by multiple people. So multiple people have looked at the data, both the arts-based data and the interview and focus group data. And we've come together and we've shared what we see in the data. And then we build more complex code trees out of those experiences. And so this is the same code tree reimagined through the lens of multiple people talking about the data and also more deeply going back to the data. Because every time you look at the data again, you see new things. And so we're in this code tree, we're naming and renaming and clustering to provide more nuanced categories and themes. So you see that we still have categories around the current context. We have categories around land, but we're also starting to build theories out of those categories. And so the themes are now developing into theories. And so we have land was a theme in the last code tree, and now it's coming out as a bit of a theory around land being objective. Something that is sacred and unknowable is one of the codes that is here, but place being more subjective, that humans tend to want to own land, or at least some groups of humans through processes of colonization want to own land, and then that is seen as a subjective, that somebody can own it, when in fact land is perhaps not, when we think about it, not really or should not be ownable. So this is a bit of a theorizing that's coming out of categorizing and coming up with themes, seeing within those themes what people are saying about those particular things, and then building a kind of theory out of that. And this is emerging from our work. The other theory that there's a couple more theories that I'll describe out of this data to give a little bit more examples. So place as a verb is a theory that's been building out of this idea that informs transcendence. So this concept of place not being a static thing, but being something that is in movement, that moves over time and space, and that we can actually use processes of understanding place and our relationship to place to inform kinds of activism and action in the world, and even transcendence beyond boundaries of issues of equity. So these are theories that are coming out of the work that we're involved in, that are coming from our participants in the ways that they're experiencing place and how they're contesting place at the same time. And another one that's quite interesting that's come out is this idea of place as an internal landscape. So the themes of bodies, minds, and communities informed theorizing to one view of place, and obviously we're coming up with multiple views of place in this work, but one view of place is this idea of place as an internal landscape. And so what do you do when you have these theories? How do you describe them? You can often describe them either using tables or images like they did in the Inuit food insecurity, or you can you also go back to the themes and you use quotes to describe the theories that you're seeing. So I just mentioned this theory of place as an internal landscape, and so this is a way that I would describe it in my research, is that I would show a code tree, and then I would articulate how this theory came out from that piece of the code tree. And then I would go back and use a very specific quote from a participant to illustrate. And so I go back to the data. So you go from sort of micro to macro. And then when you're describing the theme, you make sure that you go back to the micro of the data to give to ground the theme. And so here, there's an example of this idea of place as an internal landscape. And the codes that inform this theme are codes around identity, around physical body, around memory, emotion, and ideas. And then we have a quote here from a participant who talks specifically, this quote is a quote that was coded for multiple things, coded around the idea of memory in particular, and coded around the idea of emotion. And then made its way into to the code tree, categorized under this idea of internal landscape. And then this is how we illustrate the theory that we're building. So you see in this quote that this participant is talking about place as something inside of us, and becoming acquainted with ourselves during this time of isolation, and the challenges of that, and the intrusive thoughts that can kind of come in waves. And this was a key quote that helped us to build this theory of place as an internal landscape. So as we're describing what place is, one of the things we're describing is this internal place and how that's been affected in this time of COVID. And this image here is also an image that was created as part of our project. So there's a quote here from the direct speaking into this theory, and then there's an image, which this image denotes a brain with dandelions, and for sort of a metaphor around intrusive thoughts and around memory and emotion and sort of ideas, and all of these things being represented in this visual depiction, which is also something that we coded in our data as place being an internal landscape. So I know these are lots of very complex ideas. Hopefully that we're giving some examples and we're pulling them out in ways that are making sense to people. But let's go back to your data, because this is how you're going to really make sense of this, because you're going to be coding your own research data. And doing so, you'll be learning these skills and applying the skills. And I think that it will all become even more clear when you do that. So how are we going to do that? Well, we did, through the tutorials last week, start to do that by developing a class coding framework. So you brainstormed ideas that came up in your data that we can use as codes. I took all of the coding frameworks that came from each of the tutorials and I put them all together. And this is the broad, this is the synthesized, coding framework that we can use as a class to begin to make sense of the interview data. And so there are 14 different categories here with subcodes or codes under them. And each of these were identified through the tutorials. And there are actually multiple codes that were identified for each of these categories. I just listed 3 per category here. But on your e-class, you will have a very fulsome list of them, so you can use this as a starting point, as a guiding framework to begin to analyze your research data. There are no right or wrong amounts of codes, but this is a good starting framework to begin with. I think that we probably could generate more, but you don't want too many to start. But there's definitely no right or wrong amount. It all is what is emerging from your data. But this is a guiding framework. You can use this, but you can also change it. And so when you're engaging in your coding of your interview transcripts, you can add codes to this framework. You can move things around if you think, if for your data, a certain code belongs under a different category, you can create a brand new category. This is a beginning, just like I showed you with the first code tree of our research, but the iterations of these frameworks will lead to different frameworks. And each of you probably will end up with a subset of this framework for your coding. So you're probably not going to be talking about all 14 of these topics or categories in your coding. You're going to hone in on a specific area, and then you're going to make your own framework because of what you're seeing coming out of the transcripts that you're analyzing. Again, you can do this in groups, and on Zoom next Monday, I will go into the details of your assignment and how you will approach this coding. But you will be applying this coding framework and then adapting it for interview transcripts that you're going to be analyzing for your final assignment. So this is a deductive approach. You already are going in with a coding framework that you're going to be applying to the data. And in tutorials this week, as well as in our Zoom session, we're going to delve further in how we do this, and you're actually going to do it in your tutorials. So if you're still a little fuzzy on this, this is going to become very clear both through our Zoom session next Monday and also in your tutorials next week, because you're going to be applying this framework directly to the transcripts. You're going to, in groups, analyze one transcript, and then you're going to be really getting a sense of how you're going to do this for your final assignment, because it's exactly what you'll be doing for your final assignment. But I hope this intro and setup has been useful, and I look forward to the further discussion with you, and we're going to be spending the next couple of weeks on analysis, so we're going to be delving more into this stuff, and so have no fear. We're going to unpack it even further, and by the end of the several sessions, I'm confident that it will become quite clear to you how to engage in these processes.